So actually, what made you be actually venture to the career of neurological healing and rehabilitation? Rehabilitation.
Yeah. Well, it comes from a personal perspective. I was a kid diagnosed with severe ADHD and I was actually medicated. And then I also, I spent my whole life basically from 0 to 18 in and out of the doctor's offices, lots of medication, sick, and really, I didn't want to I felt like there was always something underneath going on. And then I had speech and language issues.
Mm.
So I actually spent years actually in speech therapy. And then my brother is actually he was a vaccine injured child. He actually got meningitis following the vaccine. So I watched my brother for 6 straight weeks in and out of ice baths. And I'll never forget the day that, the doctor came in and actually told my dad that his little boy was going to be okay. And I watched my dad hug this doctor, and my dad is in tears. My dad was my superhero. And I was like, I'm going to be that guy one day. And, I went on this journey. I started reading encyclopedias at a very, very early age. And I actually developed an addiction from the medication that I was on. I was on methamphetamines for 18 years and it was prescribed, but my addiction was actually books. And what happened is I memorized pages of books. I mean, I'm addicted to books. I read so much and I can memorize the page numbers. And I literally have a photographic memory, so I memorize everything. And, the really neat thing about science is that science, especially, in neurology, it's very linear.
Mm.
But how I got to this component was really initially it was kind of like a selfish aspect. I wanted to learn how to fix myself. And so I decided to actually go into cancer research when I was at LSU and started studying really cool things about, sound waves and nutrition. Then I actually got involved in, biochemistry, which is the body's biochemical system. And in studying that, I realized that, and this is just my personal opinion, that people were being treated for the wrong things, that we were being treated for symptoms and not actually the original cause. And when you look at biochemistry, it's the body's natural chemical system. There's vitamin minerals that run these systems, and no one checks for these things. And literally, I think the diet that we eat there's so many toxins in this. And I think that a lot of people actually are malnourished. And today, that's what I basically clinically find is that, I find that all my patients, whether they're autistic or have ALS or MS or MS, you name it, these are all, to my opinion, they're labels. Yes, they have, they definitely have diagnoses and symptoms that associated with that, but underneath, there's a whole host of things that are actually the causation that have led to, this disease or this disability. And that's what really got me involved was actually, it was just a personal, I watched my brother, basically, not die from meningitis to, now I was off of all my medications. And yeah, I love science.
Mm, mm. And I just want to touch on something that you quite mentioned. And I believe that's something that I didn't touch on when it comes to nutrition. And one thing that I realized that nutrition is important for our health and our mental well-being. And sometimes we are told that to be in these restrictive diets, and for example, the carnivore diet, whereas often it involves meat. So, to my understanding, that for you to actually have that healthy life, to have that nutritious life and in a healthy way, you don't only need meat within your food, but also other vitamins. What is your take on the carnivore diet?
Yeah, I'm a fan of it. I also think that, I'm a fan of the carnivore diet. I really don't like high carb diets. So I'm the polar opposite. So I like more high protein diets because proteins are the backbone of the immune system. The next thing is I'm a really big fan more of the paleo diet, more of the caveman kind of style diet,
Mm,
which,
mm,
is basically carnivore, but it's mixed with, vegetables and stuff.
mm.
I apologize. Can I real quick? Can I shut my door? I'm in my office. I just finished with patients and there's a little autistic kid screaming.
Okay, no problem, doc. No problem. Mm,
So sorry, they didn't shut my door. Apologize for that. No, but that's, again, I'm a fan of the carnivore diet. I'm more into the paleo diet, but I think that if people really want to get really healthy, I feel like people need to look at seasonal eating. And so seasonal eating is basically eating foods within the season.
Mm.
I'm a very big fan into mitochondria. So mitochondria is going to deal with, how light basically, energizes our body. And I think that, and this is the personal opinion, but I think that we should be eating foods that you would get at a natural farmer's market. So for example, like if you're in Egypt, I think that you need to be eating foods based off of, what's in the natural habitat. If you're in America, and
Mm.
you live in Louisiana or Texas or Florida, you should be eating foods within the natural light environment that you're in.
Mm.
And in saying that is because mitochondria, these cells in the body, they produce energy. So if you're eating foods out of a season, what happens is that I believe that that can actually impinge on the way that your energy production is going to be. So in saying that, I'm a fan of the carnivore diet. I love the carnivore diet. I'm a bigger fan of the paleo diet, but then I'm really big into seasonal eating. So if you basically take the paleo diet and you bring in seasonal eating, eating foods that you would get at your local food market based off of the environment you're in, that right there to me is really great diet and this is what I typically prescribe my patients as well.
Mm. 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 And still on the conversation on nutrition and dieting. And as I've said, that people will have different views when it comes to autism. And with my own perspective, I feel like it is misunderstood. And you mentioned that you were also diagnosed with in terms of ADHD. Would you say that eating nutritious food has an impact on the way you perceive it, the way in terms of these conditions of mental health disorders?
1,000%. I'd say this is that, I think that, my clinical opinion on looking at autism, I think that you're seeing more of a inflammatory condition. So the brain's basically inflamed. And the very interesting thing about autism, it's a spectrum. So not every child is the same. So if every child was the same, then you would figure out that, one nutrient works or one, medication or one diet is going to specifically work for that individual. But what's happening is these kids, their brain and their body's inflamed. And you can see this because when you run stool samples, we actually see that these kids have very high levels of inflammatory markers. So one of the examples is something called caloprotectin. The next thing that we're seeing in these kids is something called zonulin. Zonulin is actually it's an indication of something called intestinal permeability. And then you have layman term that's considered leaky gut. The next thing that we see is something called dysbiosis, which is abnormal gut gastrointestinal bacteria.
Mm.
So what's happening is these kids typically test positive for Clostridium, which is yeast. And what happens is, where does this come from? And it comes because these kids are picky eaters and they eat excessive carbohydrates. So
Mm.
they're eating all these breads, pastas, crackers, rice, cereal, butter noodles, potato chips, French fries. These kids aren't typically eating meat. They're not eating vegetables. They're not eating, fruit. They're eating these things that naturally dissolve inside the mouth. Well, one is because these kids are actually picky eaters, and a lot of these kids actually can't smell. And a
Mm.
lot of these kids, when we run their stool, they actually have a reduction in something called elastase or pancreatic elastase, which is actually the enzymes that break down food.
Mm.
So these kids have a gastrointestinal problem, also that translates into a neurological problem, or you can see a vice versa, that a kid had a neurological problem that then manifested into a kid having a gastrointestinal. So diet is huge because that's what's going to nourish, the brain. That's what's going to nourish the gut. That's what's going to nourish the immune system. And so you need to have a diversity of food. You need to have a diversity of nutrients. But if these kids only eat the same exact thing on a consistent basis, what happens is their body can develop an immunity to it. They can start developing something called sensitivities, where now these kids could actually literally be sensitive, which means that they're having a stress response to the food that they're actually eating. So when we run these labs, we actually see these kids typically have something called gliadin antibodies, which is actually the protein derivative of gluten. So,
Mm,
and that's gluten is everything these kids eat. And, I say there's two things. 'Cause I see this at work, and I've been doing this for 13 years
mm,
and working with parents. You have some parents that say they put their child on a gluten-free diet and it was like a complete life-changing experience. And then you see some that say they tried a gluten-free diet and they didn't really notice very much. And one of the things is it's not just, gluten that's a big trigger. There's other things like dairy, there's corn, there's soy. Those are four foods that can actually cause a lot of inflammation in these kids. Not that these foods are actually bad in my clinical opinion, but what happens is these foods, they actually have a heavy, when the digestive system breaks it down, the molecular weight of the protein derivative inside of gluten, corn, soy, and dairy is very large.
mm,
So think about this. If this kid has an inflamed brain and the brain controls the immune system and how our body's going to get rid of inflammation and detoxify in our gastrointestinal, if the brain's in stress, you're not going to rest and digest. So
mm,
then now you eat this food that has excessive carbohydrates and carbs turn into sugar. So if
mm,
you don't break this food down, what happens is all these carbs basically turn into sugar. And sugar feeds bacteria. And then if you get too much sugar basically or carbs in the gut, you're going to inflame the brain. And that turns into hyperactivity.
mm,
So it's very interesting when we actually look at these children on the spectrum. It's that they don't just have like autism, they actually have sinus dysbiosis. They have abnormal bacteria inside the nose, and anything in the nose directly impacts the brain. All these kids that are nonverbal, what happens is if a parent actually runs what's called a mycotoxin, a urine sample, they're going to see that these kids are going to test positive for mycotoxins, which is basically fungus and mold. And where's this coming from? Well, it's because if these kids, they basically have something called retained primitive reflexes. They breathe in mold in the environment or environmental pollutants. They don't get rid of it. Anything in the nose goes to the brain. Anything in the nose goes to the gut.
mm,
So it's very, very interesting in the topic of autism and diet because, I also see some parents that compliance is very hard because, the kid gets fixated on wanting to eat, chicken nuggets and pastas and breads. And so then trying to adopt and change a diet, these kids don't like change.
mm,
So it's very frustrating and challenging to try to start altering foods. But what we try to teach these parents is that there's strategies, for example, activating something called cranial nerves that actually innervate the face and the tongue to increase the taste receptors. So
mm,
that way these kids can start to actually want to eat more foods instead of eating the same thing over and over again.
mm, mm,
Yeah, there's a lot to autism and a
mm.
lot going on.
And it's something that it gives me a different perspective, or one would say new information, because I myself work in a student assistant, whereas I work in a disability department, whereas actually we actually had conversations around most of often autism. It's something that as I said, that's something that is viewed as something that people have a lack of information of it, because at first when I was tasked to actually do a research in terms of doing, we had I would say that a educational lecturer or a movie thing, so I had to search a documentary, and through my research, and that's where I found, oh, flip, there's this thing that is called non-verbal autism. Whereas I'm not quite sure about the actual book. I'm not quite sure about the book, but it was written from Japan, whereas it spoke about autism, non-verbal autism. I forgot the details on it, and it really intrigued me. And it's a documentary that is segmented in different places. I think one place was here in Africa and in the States and also in England, different countries. And it really showed me, oh, look, there's this thing, and people actually are not aware of such information. And now today you actually tell me new things when it comes to autism, whereas in the side of nutrition. And sometimes we actually don't take carefully look when it comes to nutrition.